Hi, I'm Dave Dugal, the founder and CEO of Enterprise Web. Today's presentation, Intelligent Orchestration with Graphs, the smart way to coordinate SAP services, was motivated by a hackathon hosted by SAP Labs. SAP provided models, files, and endpoints, and we're seeking innovative new approaches to interoperability and automation. SAP, like everyone else, is looking for ways to make it easier for customers to connect their products and services. As you'll see, we demonstrated how our platform enabled rapid modeling of an end-to-end process across SAP and non-SAP endpoints. So Enterprise Web offers a no-code integration automation platform. It enables event-driven end-to-end processes across distributed endpoints for dynamic and agile business operations. And the whole notion is enterprise-wide web scale. So you can think of Enterprise Web as being a cloud IDE or a design environment, a platform for composing services into event-driven applications. And it's powered by a real-time graph-connected domain model, which provides the metadata and the relationships in the state to drive automation. So it helps organizations bring order to increasingly fragmented operations because we're giving you a unified model that helps you control what is truly a distributed and diverse domain. So with Enterprise Web, you can rapidly model that complex distributed domain. You can then onboard diverse solution elements, whether they be databases and devices, services and systems, people and processes, as loosely coupled objects, as loosely coupled domain objects in a catalog. Those objects can then be declaratively composed into services and chained into event-driven processes. And essentially, as I said, you're leveraging shared metadata, relationships, and state for discovery, intelligent orchestration, closed-loop automation, and policy-based management. And Enterprise Web is giving customers a single source of truth across their complex and distributed domains. So when I say no code, no compromises, I'm saying, you know, no manual integration, no writing scripts, no coding events, no developing interfaces, no code, period. Most no-code solutions are designed for a citizen developer or a business user to rapidly model relatively simple applications. But Enterprise Web was really designed to make complex event-driven applications easy. The no-code design environment abstracts away the distributed systems complexity to speed and ease service delivery and evolution. Enterprise Web itself is cloud native, so the runtime is scalable, distributable, and resilient. There's a lot of information out there about Enterprise Web. Here's two good links for you. One is an article that you can read, a detailed technical article on InfoQ, and the link is there below. And there's there's a YouTube video you can also watch if you want to get into a little bit more detail about how we do graph modeling. So what is the roadblock to the intelligent enterprise that SAP talks about? So enterprise customers are confronted by an increasingly complex array of SAP and non-SAP endpoints that they need to integrate, orchestrate, manage, and maintain. And of course, these endpoints are evolving all the time. So, you have to be able to not only code them once, you need to be able to adapt them as updates come through, standards change, or requirements change. Those are all considerations of a modern application. SAP offers this one domain model, and it is absolutely a step towards unifying the SAP product portfolio. It essentially is it's a graph of all of their products. However, it's a graph of their products, but it actually lacks the semantics to actually use it directly to drive automation. So the solutions, with SAP still require a mix of custom code, manual integration, BPMN workflow modeling, and interface development. Of course, that's time-consuming, expensive. It ends up in tightly coupled solutions that are brittle, hard to change, et cetera. Of course, this is not just SAP. This is across, this is what the problems with everybody's struggling with. In today's demo, we're going to show you how Enterprise Web essentially will call the SAP Graph API. We're going to extract the set of disconnected, what they call one domain model core objects. We're going to extract their model, their schemas and interfaces. We're going to generate a unified graph-connected SAP domain model with all the necessary semantics and metadata for driving automation. So we're literally going to create a single REST API over the top of an SAP domain model. That SAP domain model is going to allow human and machine exploration of that model. And it's going to support no-code declarative composition of end-to-end services as we've described. Service designers with this model in place, and we're talking about doing this in minutes, with this model in place, service designers can now import SAP flowcharts to extract core objects, business logic, and integration points from static BPMN files to jumpstart the development of new cloud-native event-driven applications. Essentially, this is application modernization on steroids, right? We're also going to be able to enable, we're also going to allow service designers to import existing design elements like JavaScript and HTML files, which will be then used by our system to generate your highly dynamic user interfaces. All of this with no code. The system then is going to expose a single REST API over the set of connected endpoints. So so to architects, we're going to expose a single API over the entire SAP domain. And to service designers, we're going to expose a single REST API over their service that essentially abstracts all the complexity of the underlying connected endpoints. So the use case today is SAP requisition to fulfillment. It's very well known in the SAP world, and we're going to start with this business process, this flowchart, this BPMN flowchart. We're going to import it. We're going to extract, all the user's tasks, process logic, and endpoints out of it. And we're going to generate a full-blown implementation with the integration done and user interfaces in place. No code. We're actually going to extend the use case today to make it a digital business scenario, so that actually an order is going to actually result in an application being deployed onto a cloud target host, and that product will be that application will be then ready to use. So a fully digital process. In this use case, Enterprise Web is going to play the role of an intermediary, sitting between the SAP Business Hub and all of the core objects and services, legacy systems, as well as the people and systems consuming the user interface and API that Enterprise Web generates. So Enterprise Web will sit in the center, mediating all the relationships, and no other products will be required. Right? Essentially, we're stripping away the cruft, all the middleware necessary that would be, and the cloud native tools to enable very complex solutions very quickly. Bill Malik, our chief system architect, is going to provide today's demo. And during the demo, he's going to effectively play three roles. Actually, first, he's going to essentially introduce you to the product, our user interface, and the navigation around there. But effectively, he's going to play three roles. He's going to come in as a solution architect who's going to work with the one domain model. He's going to import the SAP graph. He's going to access the SAP graph API to extract the one domain model. He's going to generate that truly programmable SAP domain within Enterprise Web. Then, as a service designer, he's going to go in there and essentially compose the functional elements required for this new service. As a process designer, he's going to go in, import the SAP BPMN flowchart to jumpstart the design. That's going to extract the tasks and the objects and generate a cloud-native event-driven process. He's going to do this all live in front of you. Then he's going to actually place an order, right? He's going to actually run this process. He's going to place an order. The order is effectively an event. It's going to trigger a new instance of this process. He's going to run the process in front of you. And then he's going to actually show you how Enterprise Web is transactional. It'll provide a trace of everything Enterprise Web did. If there was a failure, we have compensations, and rollback, and all of those things necessary to be an enterprise-grade solution. So without further ado, I'll pass the baton on to Bill, who will run the demo.
Okay, so I'm going to start out as that solution architect. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to log into our model manager, and then I'm going to point the Enterprise Web Platform at the SAP Graph API, and you're going to see me extract that full one domain model and generate what is really a truly programmable SAP domain. So Enterprise Web is deployed in this instance on Google Cloud. It could be any of your sort of standard cloud native infrastructure providers. It's a set of Kubernetes pods that are all arranged in a cluster with a cloud native backing store. In this case, it's Cassandra, but it could just as easily be on an SAP infrastructure running on HANA. Each one of these pods has both an API and a UI set up, and they're all divided along the sort of role-based access kind of, what kind of jobs would a particular user in a role do. In this case, we have a model manager for someone like the architect that we're going to play the role of right now. And later for someone designing a service, we'll have a service manager. And there are a number of pods here divided along those lines. Right now, what I'm going to do is log into the model manager, which is really a design time only portal that allows me to look at the graph models that are going to support my applications. So I'm going to log in here as an architect. So using the model manager, I'm presented with the actual graphs that support applications at large. Out of the box, we have our cloud concepts that allow a distributed application to be automated, and then some organizational concepts that allow us to support businesses at large. If I click into either one of these graphs, what I can look at is actually the individual elements that make up the graph, or I can take a look at the graph overall. If I were to zoom in on this at any sort of level here, and I'll just do that really quickly here, what I can start to see is the connected nature, things like the formats, YAML, XML, etc. that we support, and really it goes even further. The kinds of things that will be needed to support an artifact, it's things like traffic flows, DNS elements, whatever that lower level complexity is all represented here in our graph, and it allows us to very easily make references to something like a format and have the system build the glue or interfaces that are going to be needed between it, and it goes right through to supporting not just things like data formats but also behaviors, which is one of the big advantages of our system, is that you're not just looking at sort of data only apps or endpoint integration in that way. You can actually automate the applications that will run across with things like callbacks, trace, exception handling, and so on, can all be automated as a result of the richness of this graph. Once we've imported a couple of SAP endpoints, I'll show you some of the drill down. What's important here though is that we would like to actually add to this the SAP graph model. So SAP graph, as we know, we can see it here. It's got its website. We're going to look at the sandbox here, and what we're going to do is actually import directly from the sandbox all the endpoints that are supported. We've seen them probably before, but you can take a look. This is just the SAP supplied sandbox. I can look at one of the elements that might be in here for any one of the APIs, and what we're going to do is en masse, we're going to import this entire set of APIs and have it mapped. Any of these lower level details don't really matter to us so much individually, but what the system will do is literally map them to existing concepts and start to allow us to basically create sort of a set of proxies around working with the SAP graph that'll make it very easy. We won't have to write manual integration. We won't have to know every element in here to be able to write applications over the top. We'll be able to really quickly just consume this and work with it the kind of way that it's intended to be used without writing any code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this endpoint that we're going to be working with here. So let me just copy that, the beta endpoint. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use what they call Postman. It's just an API-based system to interact with Enterprise Web Graph, right? So what I'm going to say is that I'd like to add a new graph model here, the one domain model. And as I'd sort of expect here, I'll show you, is that we're of course going to end up with something that has errors, right? We're going to see them down here. We don't have a model, so where do we get that model from? So this is where we talked earlier about the fact the system can actually interrogate sources, right? Word docs, Excel docs, XML schema, so on. Well, in this case, what we'd like to do is actually just have the system look at a particular OData endpoint, which is what the one domain model is. I'm going to supply a little bit of information such as where for the system to actually look. And what it can do is actually derive a set of relationships here or extract the model, start mapping it to things like the enterprise web existing concepts. And it'll do all that in a split second. So I'm going to go ahead and actually run this API. And what we'll see down here in the results is a full mapping of the model. Things like language codes that happens to be One of the ODM models that was available is pulled out for us. Things like the actual values here are all going to be mapped into enterprise web and normalized. And if I go further to something like a person, for instance, what we'll see is that it's actually mapped to an enterprise web concept. It derives all of the relationships between them, maps keys, and so on. And what it does all really the work for us in that couple of split seconds to create a full model that we could then start to integrate or work with in enterprise web. So I'm going to go ahead and actually copy this model. So just a second here. So this will be the model that we'll add to our system. This is going to be actually pretty neat here, because what we're going to do is just a really quick little submit. Graph has actually been added to the system with full trace and all that kind of good stuff. And if we go back into enterprise web now, and all we do is click again, what we're going to see is we have a new source. We have that SAP graph that's been imported for us and mapped. All things like versioning and so on are actually in play here. It's a full object. It's not something that's written in a parallel system somewhere else. It's actually something we can interact with full versioning, history, security, and all those kinds of good things over top of it. And it's actually something that we can look at directly in enterprise web. So this model now includes all those elements that we saw a moment ago: company codes, country codes, etc. Things like customer models and so on. It's really taken this entire SAP graph structure and converted it into an operational graph. So let's have a look at what that graph actually renders as in eWeb. We can zoom in on it if we want for a moment, and we can see the kinds of connections that are in play here: organizations connected to addresses, connected to persons, etc. So all that's been imported into eWeb. But now the important piece of this is really that when we start to look at something like we look at maybe an order, what we can find is that an order to requisition has already been mapped into the system itself. It's got a number of relationships. When we start to drill in on what that order actually looks like, we're going to see a few interesting things. What we're going to find is that things like an order date, which is sort of a higher level property, have been extracted for us. We can see the basic relationships that this thing is going to be connected with, and then we can start to look at it in terms of context within the system, right? So we can see here that an order requisition, of course, has tasks attached and entities and so on, an internal order connected to an organization, and all this kind of stuff will be leveraged automatically when the system starts using this in the context of an app. But the nice thing about this is that we can really drill into it even more at a system level. We can see that what the system did with this order requisition endpoint is actually build up an entity around it, right? It supports things like processes that the system might automate, and we actually have a package for how the system will, if you want, integrate with this endpoint. You can see drilling into it now, there's a whole lot more detail here that doesn't just come from the API. You can see that the formats, things like OData, of course, are supported, but if I want to translate that into XML, for instance, it's going to be automatic within the system. And this goes on to whatever level that is that you want to actually explore this. So if I start to look at things like the artifacts that are needed to support this, a system around it, we're going to start to see things like load balancing, other kinds of global load balancing, the things that are needed for the system to sort of implement the non-functional concerns and so on, are all going to be able to be automated around this endpoint that we just discovered in eWeb. Now that the SAP graph has been mapped into the system, I can use it to build a whole array of applications, whether they're just simple endpoints, business processes, etc. Anything I want to automate in the SAP space is now going to be really a matter of composition and configuration. So I'm going to make use of this in our specified use case. So now what I'm going to do is play the role of the service designer who actually wants to implement that business process that we saw at the beginning. I'm going to declaratively compose my tool chain first from the catalog. I'm going to pick things like a component to execute workflows, a component to host my UI, and so on, and even those third-party endpoints. And what you're going to see is there's no manual integration. It's just a really simple matter of being able to pick things out of a catalog and then configure them in place. So I'm going to do that as the service designer using one of the other enterprise web modules. In this case, it's going to be the service manager. So when I log into this component, what I'm presented with is a simple catalog of the components I might want to use for my application. In this case, they're just places where I might be hosting my new service. but this can be an extensive array depending on what you've onboarded for your solution, including anything from third-party runtimes to third-party systems, anything I might want to integrate. In this case, I'm just going to be composing a new service. It will be our purchase requisition service, and I'm going to go ahead and create that. Now what the system will do is actually walk me through in a sort of wizard-like way the kinds of requirements that I might need for implementing this service. So I'm going to jump right to the actual composition model. There's a number of configurations that I might work with in here. At this point though, I'm just going to keep things very simple, and I'm going to say, what is my compositional model? Or really, to say it a little differently, I'm going to compose a solution stack. What are those parts? So I look in my catalog for services that have already been either mapped or made available to me. And what I'd like to do in this case is I'd simply like to create a process engine, if you want. So workflow engine. So I picked a service that Enterprise Web provides out of the catalog. It's something that I can now start composing with other elements. So in my service catalog, I also have things like a general purpose controller from Enterprise Web, a UI host, which is something that I definitely want to use here. I can connect it up inside of my graph. And what I'm doing is just building sort of a service topology, if you want, out of the components, showing how that, if you want, quote-unquote tool chain, right? Although it's really just a matter of cloud-connected elements are going to play or interact with one another. I want to also, in this kind of a case, I want to include the SAP graph, so any integrations that might actually go through that graph. I'll connect that to my workflow engine, and what you'll find here is actually pretty interesting. I have one more component I want to add before I go on, and that's that I have this cloud NFV ordering system. It's an Enterprise Web, sort of third-party system here. What I'm going to be able to do is place orders for actual products against it, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and connect that. Now the thing is, I have a workflow engine that now has access to all of these. It will, facilitate things like the mappings in and out of them. But what's kind of really the best part about this is that as I start to pop into these, I get configurations for them, right? Do I want to be working with an actual API ordering schema that comes from, sort of a third party, in this case, literally importing a standards-based ordering schema, and it will integrate automatically with the SAP graph? How do I want to interact with the SAP graph? You can see that I can do things like by default, it's kind of already figuring out that, well, I might want to be actually sourcing my schemas out of here, not just the instance data. These things aren't mutually exclusive, so I can literally have something in this kind of a case that's going to be translating the schemas that come out of SAP into sort of another host format. There's a lot of different kinds of choices that I can make here, including things like synchronization on demand. What I've done is actually selected that whatever system gets implemented or whatever process gets implemented down the line, it's actually going to be synchronized in this kind of a case. It'll be an evented interaction with the SAP graph, and no one has to write the kind of glue code or exceptions or any of the other semantics that are going to be needed to implement that. And I can go further here. I can start to drill in on things like my process engine, and I can decide what's the model that I want to implement. And in this case, it would be a new one that someone would come in and model. But now I'm going to sort of change gears here. I've set up my basic, if you want, service toolchain. And now I'm going to play the role of someone who's a process designer who will actually come back into the system and start making use of this. Okay, so as a process designer, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up that same service. I'm going to make use of that tool chain, if you want, that's already in place. And I'm going to start by importing an existing SAP BPMN flowchart. It was the one that we saw earlier. You're going to see how that actually jumpstarts the process. It'll extract the tasks and objects and transform them into this cloud-native event-driven process that little service topology that I just created as the other user will make use of. So back in eWeb, I'm going to use this simple UI here that allows me to upload artifacts, really the kinds of files that I want the system to be able to extract information from. I start with that BPMN chart that we had talked about earlier. I can see the system has shortlisted the kinds of compatible data types that might be actually able to use. It's now an artifact in the system that I can derive process information from. Likewise, I also want to be able to generate my UIs, so I'm going to go ahead and upload a bit of JavaScript and HTML that was created that are sort of implementing those UIs, and the system will take that and actually create a full dynamic API wrapper around it. So you'll basically implement a dynamic UI based on this bit of information here that we're going to be uploading. So I'll take that zip file. I'll flag it as a UI model. Now I've done really all the work I need as a process designer to start kickstart the system into being able to implement the logic that's behind this. If I go over to my lifecycle operations and policies tab, what I can see here is that there's a business process that's been derived from something. In this case, if I open it up, what I'm going to see is that the system has extracted all of the kinds of swim lines, user profiles, actual tasks, and really all of the logic that was behind that BPMN chart that we imported earlier. I can drill in on any one of these tasks and see the information that's actually behind it. So I could do things like even take a look at what follows converting this requisition to a purchase order. So the system will have converted this into an object that I can then start to configure. It has to do with, it's a human task. It's going to have things like a user interface that's going to be custom. It's going to be literally implemented from that bit of code that was uploaded that had the HTML and so on in it. It'll build a dynamic UI based on the task itself. I can see options like being able to reassign these things as human tasks, etc. I can look at post conditions, and what I can literally see is, well, when this task is finished, what did the system extract, including things like thresholds, and I can see that basically there's a parallel flow here represented already in the kind of task information that I'm describing. And what I'm seeing is that, it's part of my state chart, which is fine. And if I want to look at this as something that's more like a traditional workflow, if I want the system to render this in a way that I can see it sort of looking like how it will execute, the system will do that for me. I can click a little button here. What I see is my basic process rendered as a kind of sequential workflow. I can see that the first thing is to identify that source. After that, we're going to be assigning the source, converting the purchase requisition. I may have parallel processes that run inside. And what I can do is sort of see if you want, the what if of how this process would unfold going forward. And then I can actually modify this workflow right in place, right? So I could add new steps if I want, or I can do things like, in this kind of a case, we had selected as part of our service model the ability to interact with a third-party system, our ordering system. I might want that as part of my process. So the system intelligently includes that. It now becomes just a task that I can really simply, if you want, I can rearrange this workflow in a very easy kind of manner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually just replace a couple of the steps here with sort of a full-on automation. So I'm just going to modify what this process looks like. And it's kind of just this easy to be able to take an existing process model and repurpose it for something a little bit different. What we're going to do now is start with an unsolicited purchase request, right? If you want a service order that hits the system, and what the system will do now, instead of it just taking it through to a form, will actually order the product in the end and sort of complete the end-to-end application rather than just making this part of sort of a standalone kind of human workflow. So I've updated my process model quite a bit now. I could go in and I could, work on different configurations. I could specify different things in terms of the lower level details. But this is now my business process that I want to see executed. I'm going to add that to my catalog, and then I'm going to go start to use it as an end user. So just like that, the service is actually ready to be consumed. So now to complete the demo, we're actually going to place an order, which will trigger a new event, and we'll look at the instance of the process as it unfolds. Inside eWeb, we're just going to take a look at the sort of, if you want, metadata or logging trail that's actually provided around this new service. We can see a few things here, and basically we just have links to things like the user interfaces that'll be involved that were generated by the system, and we actually have links to all the APIs that are behind this that are supporting it, as well as things like a log of the workflow instances and so on. So we'll trace this across one order and take a look at what's going on behind the scenes. What's nice is that both of these UIs have already been rendered that were involved in the process. there was this create order requisition for the first step that's going to take this initial order and actually create events for it and so on. And then there's a secondary one for a manager who actually will take this thing, a requisition that hit the system. You can see that it's empty right now. There haven't been any instances yet, but we'll be able to take it and route it to the appropriate order. And then it will actually flow right through to that ordering system that you saw before. Along the way, though, there are the involved graph APIs, so things like the order requisition and the customer order that are going to be used in this process. And right now, you'll see they're, of course, empty. Right, and so we have basically a full trace that we can look at as this instance unfolds. So we'll go ahead and do that. So right now we have no instances in the system. We're going to create such an order. So we're just going to create a new IoT service order. Distribution will be direct sales, fulfillment type will be automated, and so on. All of this again comes from that backing API, even things like a connected customer code. We're going to place that order, and you can see, a fraction of a second, an event has already hit the system, and now we can actually take a look at the kind of information that's been collected. So what we'll see is that for our customer order here, order requisition, which is the first point, we can see things like the distribution channel, whatever. The full detail here of all of the data that we collected and that was needed for that order has already been pushed into the SAP Graph APIs. You can see here inside the system we have that new instance. It's at status as requisition, and again, these are all pulled from the SAP model itself, including things like states and so on that will be managed automatically by eWeb. I can look at the execution trace of this, and I can just see a few things that happened. Northbound API order happened through that UI that was created. It was modified from JSON, which was the format of the UI, into OData, and then it was pushed into one of the actual SAP Graph APIs. So all that's available, instantly within eWeb. So you can do a full trace if there was ever a problem with it, etc. This will all appear here. And when I say this is evented, we mean literally to the point of if we're using, say, a second user interface, in this case, this process requisition form. As soon as that user interface is accessed, you can see it's pulled the requisition for me. I can already start to work with it inside the UI. But even before I've done anything, really, if I've touched that resource, you can see there's a full trace here, right? That northbound API was executed and needed to know which requisitions could possibly be filled, etc. So this is all unfolding in real time as this thing runs, again with compensations and so on. So I'm going to go ahead and assign the source. You can see our order here. What's the product going to be pulled from? I can see a number of different suppliers that we're going to fill this from. It'll be enterprise web, and then the products that are available. There are a set of IoT apps that have been exposed through that API. All of that integration has been seamless here. I go ahead and I create my order, and already it's going to be reflected inside the system, right? This thing's been pushed right through to converting from what was a requisition through to a full customer order. Objects are going to be linked across APIs within that SAP graph. I can look at them here in terms of, the feeds of the APIs will reflect the statuses. There's the newer objects. This was the actual order that was placed as opposed to just the requisition. And again, all that transformation has been done automatically by eWeb. But the great thing about this is that it goes right through to actually placing an order for the service. And so what we have is actually something that, if we look at the overall workflow, we can actually see the references to both the sort of internal service instance, so the workflow instance, and then we actually have a link to the service that was created for this user, so they can go in and actually start using it, right? So it's just a simple IoT app called Homebridge. We could log into it if we wanted and start working with it. It's used for home management and with a UI, things like a dummy backing store, what have you. The details here aren't as important as the fact that we were able to automate this thing full end-to-end in eWeb, and again, with using a no-code process. So that concludes our demo of intelligent orchestration with graphs, the smart way to coordinate SAP services. Please get in touch with us if you want any more information or for a closer look. Thank you.